Hello and welcome to episode 41 of the Crash and Ride podcast. This is a special new thing I'm going to try to do every Wednesday where I explicate a song that I absolutely adore from the ground up. It's going to be available for $10 subscribers on the Patreon page. I try to provide the show for free because it's about mental health, and I don't want to be a gatekeeper for people getting help. This whole idea that you only deserve mental health care if you're wealthy or you can afford it is just bullshit. It's what our whole healthcare system is predicated upon, and I'm absolutely opposed to it. But I also really, really, really love music and really, really love songs, and I want to do a thing, where I just talk about what a song means, what its cultural context is, what some of the nuts and bolts that went into making it are, as much as I can from the perspective of a drummer who can't really play guitar. And if you hear me get something wrong, like if you're a player or you know more about an artist that I'm talking about, shoot me an email at crashandride@protonmail.com and I'll make a change and we'll get it right. The first song today is Born to Run by Bruce Springsteen. I realize, man, you're not really digging into your underground roots here, buddy. But, I think that somehow Born to Run is both under and overrated in a lot of ways because it's really an amazing song. And I'm also going to do Gimme Shelter by the Rolling Stones at some point, and I realize that that's in every goddamn Martin Scorsese film ever made, and you've heard it 8 million times, but I want to maybe help people bring fresh ears to these tracks that are just enormous, cultural touchstones like this, because every now and then I'll be riding along in the truck and I'll hear a song on the radio and I'll think, man, this song's really great, and it'll catch me off guard. And that happened with Born to Run a few years ago, and 5/8 decided to cover it because I was just kind of rocked back on my heels about just how apocalyptic it is. There's something about the whole Phil Spector wall of sound production on it that I just think is amazing. So it's okay. Let's jump into it. So for starters, let's go back to the Paleolithic era and talk about what I mean when I say the Phil Spector wall of sound. Phil Spector was a musician and producer from New York City, moved out to Los Angeles. He was famous for his production technique of, quote unquote, using the studio as an instrument. And his whole thing was to just stack layers and layers and layers of instruments on a track until it was, by his own description, Wagnerian. And and that included things like in Born to Run, there's glockenspiel and there's many layers of guitar and also both piano and organ. And so when you start stacking instruments like this, it's not a natural sound. It's not like a sort of one take, all the musicians in the studio, like a jazz recording. Like, for example, if you're listening to a John Coltrane recording from the late 50s, early 60s, you got a stereo microphone in the middle of the room, and all the musicians are sort of staged around the microphone, and there's no overdubs, there's no multiple takes. That's all technology that came in later in the 60s. And a lot of that was sort of pioneered on the West Coast with the Wrecking Crew, which was the Los Angeles-based studio musicians, Carol Kay, Hal Blaine. Glenn Campbell was a guitar player for the Wrecking Crew. I highly encourage you to check out the movie The Wrecking Crew about that whole situation. Brian Wilson, of course, from the Beach Boys, used the Wrecking Crew and the sort of Phil Spector studio environment to try to craft Pet Sounds, which ultimately, well, anyway, if you don't know that story, you should dig into that too. It kind of becomes a parable about the limits of creativity and human emotion translated into music, and of course Brian Wilson had a nervous breakdown. And anyway, that's more than I want to get into here, but let's contextualize Born to Run in terms of Bruce Springsteen's career. At this point, Bruce has 2 records out: Greetings from Asbury Park and The Wild, the Innocent and the E Street Shuffle. Both of these were recorded at 914 Studios in Blauvelt, New York. And Born to Run is also recorded at 914 Studios. Now, 914 Studios is a small kind of converted gas station studio in Blauvelt. There's a really cool little documentary about it on YouTube if you can find it. And it was about 45 minutes from New York City, and it was just over the line from New Jersey and New York, and it was a place that Bruce could go north of Asbury Park and like buckle into the studio and work without a whole lot of distractions and like the overhead of hourly time in New York City where it was really expensive. Now, I think this might have been the last recording that Bruce did at 914 Studios, because when they went back in to continue recording the rest of the album, understand that like Born to Run and another single were recorded in a separate session prior to the bulk of Born to Run. There were just so many technical problems at this small studio. It kept interrupting the workflow that they ended up moving into New York City to finish the album. Also with slightly different personnel, but we'll get into that. So the Born to Run session begins in May of 1974. And this is coming on the heels of the moderate but not complete success of the first two Bruce Springsteen records. And I feel like this is where he turned a corner as a writer. And I might get into trouble for saying this, but I feel like the first two albums, they show a lot of promise, but even Bruce admits that he was kind of aping Bob Dylan in a lot of ways in his lyric writing. And I feel like even though the songs are really, really good on Greetings from Asbury Park and The Wild, the Innocent, and the E Street Shuffle, there's a kind of Dylan-esque word salad thing happening. And I just don't think that he comes into his own as a lyricist until Born to Run. And even he admits that. I happen to be reading the Bruce Springsteen book right now. By that I mean the Bruce Springsteen autobiography, Born to Run. And on page 178 in that book, he talks about departing from his early Dylan-esque influences. Let me get the book out. Hold on. Okay, yeah, here on page 178. Bruce says, I never wrote completely in that style again. Once the record was released, I heard all the Dylan comparisons, so I steered away from it. But the lyrics and spirit of Greetings came from an unself-conscious place. Your early songs emerge from a moment when you're writing with no sure prospect of ever being heard. Up until then, it's just you and your music. That only happens once. Now, it's interesting. There's a couple things I want to talk about here. One, of all people, my dad, the Air Force officer, I guess probably at this time he was a major. He might have been a lieutenant colonel at that point. When we were riding along, I was just like a 12-year-old kid. Just started playing drums, didn't know the first thing about being in bands or anything. And some band that my dad liked was on the radio, and it was their second or third record, and he was kind of unimpressed. It might have been one of the tracks off the third Dire Straits record, and my dad said, I really like this band's first record, and I think the second one was okay, but you get your whole life to write your first record, and you get maybe a year to write your second one. And like, of all people, like my dad, who'd never written a record in his life, was such a intense music consumer that he had that insight and laid that on me. And man, that came true in my own life so many times. And I've heard other artists say that, but there's Bruce saying it. He had his whole life to write Greetings from Asbury Park, and then after that, the whole world was pressing in on him. And I think the seeds of the later Bruce Springsteen, the great writer, are there, especially on a track like Lost on the Flood, which I think is an unsung, amazing song from Greetings. But I think that there was just kind of we're coming out of the late 60s. Dylan is sort of quote-unquote voice of a generation, and Bruce kind of jumped on that bandwagon. And he was just such a gifted performer and committed live performer that he had the opportunity to grow into it. Also, it doesn't hurt that he was egregiously good-looking. Man, that was a good-looking dude. So I think that, Born to Run is the song where he turns a corner as a writer. There's a lot of other personnel stuff going on, too. It's important to note that this was the one and only session played by Ernest Boom Carter, who was a friend of David Sancious, the keyboard player on this session, piano player, I think. Might be organ. I'll have to double-check my notes. But Ernest comes in on this one session. The rhythm tracks are laid down in May of 1974, and he just crushes it. Now, he had been playing some shows with the nascent E Street Band, but this is the only recorded session of Ernest Carter, and he brings a swing to this song that I've never heard it played this way by the E Street Band since. Max Weinberg is a much more bulldozer of a drummer, more straight ahead, but the album track Born to Run has this amazing feel. And in the book, of course, Bruce he describes Ernest Carter as being more of a jazz drummer and having more of a swing feel. There's nothing he's not light hitting here. He's definitely crushing it, but he's got this swing feel that gives the song a buoyancy that I think is part of the magic of the track. Okay, before I jump into the